أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وعلى آله وأصحابه والتابعين ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين اللهم لك الحمد كما ينبغي لجلال وجهك ولعظيم سلطانك. My respected shuyukh, respected brothers and sisters, those of you who are here and those of you who are watching online, I greet you with the greetings of peace. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Once again, I would like to welcome each and every one of you to our third event in this month of October, which has been proclaimed as Islamic History Month or Islamic Heritage Month. And as you know, over the past many years, we have been providing quite extensive programming on Islamic history. Sheikh Abdullah Hakim Quick has been very instrumental in ensuring that we provide a quality program. And today is no different. Our theme today is Discover the World of Islam, Travel and Geography. Before I get into the introduction to that, I want to start us off with the recitation of the Quran, and this will be done by our Qari Abdul Fattah Jahidar.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ألم تر أن الفلك تجري في البحر بنعمة الله ليريكم من آياته إن في ذلك لآيات لكل صبار شكور وإذا غشيهم موج كالظلل دعوا الله مخلصين له الدين فلما نجاهم إلى البر فمنهم مقتصد وما يجحد بآياتنا إلا كل ختار كفور يا أيها الناس اتقوا ربكم واخشوا يوما لا يجزي والد عن ولده ولا مولود هو جاز عن والده شيئا إن وعد الله حق فلا تغرنكم الحياة الدنيا ولا يغرنكم بالله الغرور إن الله عنده علم الساعة وينزل الغيث ويعلم ما في الأرحام وما تدري نفس ماذا تكسب غدا وما تدري نفس بأي أرض تموت إن الله عليم خبير صدق الله العظيم.
Jazakumullah khair, Qari Abdul Fattah. A quick translation. Have you not seen how the ship sailed through the sea by the grace of God to show you of his wonders? In that are signs for every persevering, thankful person. When waves like canopies cover them, they call upon God, devoting their religion to him. But when he has delivered them to dry land, some of them waver. No one renounces our revelations except the treacherous blasphemer. O people, be conscious of your Lord and dread a day when no parent can avail his child, nor can a child avail his parent in anything. The promise of Allah is true. Therefore, do not let this life deceive you, nor let illusions deceive you regarding Allah. With Allah rests the knowledge of the hour. He sends down the rain, and He knows what the wombs contain. No soul knows what it will reap tomorrow. No soul knows in what land it will die. Allah is all-knowing, well-informed. Jazakumullah khair, Qari Abdul Fattah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you. Qari and his dad, Sheikh Ali Salim Sheikh Ali Salim Jahidar, have been here with us, alhamdulillah, and we have benefited from their spirituality and their knowledge of the Quran. As I said earlier, today is our third event of Islamic History Month, and today, inshallah, we will continue in our tradition of providing some extensive understanding of Islamic history, specifically today on travel and geography. And we have with us what he calls himself a professor of Islamic history. I don't know what exactly that means, but it probably is something higher than a professor. And I have great pleasure in welcoming our dear brother Hassam Munir to join us. He will be speaking on a history of travel and geography in Islam. He was born in Pakistan, arrived in Canada in 2000, and has lived in Toronto ever since. He completed a BA in History and Communication Studies at York University, and he has also completed a Master's in Mediterranean and Middle Eastern History from the University of Toronto. He works during the day as a public relations manager at Yaqeen Institute of Islamic Research. He was recognized in 2017 as an emerging historian in the city. I think you've already emerged, so you're not emerging anymore. You've already emerged as a historian in the city. In the field of history, he has formerly worked with the Ontario Historical Society as an archival researcher, and also he has experience in journalism and public relations work. His work has been featured, published, and discussed in many outlets, both locally and internationally. And so he is a gem in our own community. And I have real great pleasure in calling Brother Hassam to the podium. After this, we will have the movie in Journey to Mecca in the footsteps of Ibn Battuta. If you have family who are home, please encourage them to watch the live stream. And while they're there, they can subscribe to the links also. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Jazakallah khair, Brother Farhad, for the very generous introduction. There's a few different things going through my mind right now. It's a bit surreal to me that, first of all, I'm in person at an Islamic History Month event again, alhamdulillah, for the first time in, I guess, more than 2 years. So very grateful for that, and very grateful that you all came out. And then secondly, to be talking about this topic, travel and geography and things of that nature. I know it can be a bit of a depressing conversation right now, especially because so many travel plans were disrupted, right? And there's so many things that have happened over the past year, the most prominent, or one of the most prominent of which was we were isolated at home, right? So maybe our minds aren't in the travel zone necessarily at the moment, but hopefully as the pandemic winds down, inshallah, and as we begin to open up and have the ability once again to move around and go to different places and visit our loved ones and perform Umrah and perform Hajj and visit the places that we've always wanted to visit, some of the things you learn in this presentation will stay with you and will enrich that experience for you, inshallah. So, how does this work? There's a disclaimer I want to share before I really get started, and also giving you guys a moment while I share that disclaimer to read this beautiful poem by Imam Shafi'i, which is that there are a lot of things that are very important for us as Muslims to know about travel that will not be discussed in this presentation. This is more of a historical presentation, but of course, we have a lot of traditions from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam about the etiquettes of travel, about some of the fiqh rulings related to travel. So if we're interested in that sort of thing, we should really keep those aspects in mind as well, and make sure we make a conscious effort to learn about that from different sources, right? What are we supposed to do? What are the things that travel is supposed to teach us? The meanings of the ayat that were beautifully recited just before I came on here, etc. There are references to travel and journeys in the Quran, right? References in the hadith. There are stories of the Sahaba, of their travels, and those are our go-to sources to find inspiration and to find guidance related to travel. But I am going to skip over those aspects and focus on other aspects which you may not have ready access to from a historical standpoint. So I wanted to start off with this poem by Imam Shafi'i. It's a beautiful poem. The title translates to The Call to Travel, right? And you can get from the meaning of this poem that he is very, very strongly encouraging everyone to travel. It's a form of development, right? It's a form of self-development. It's a form of learning. And he's very much against the concept of stagnation, of being in one place for too long, staying in one place for too long. And, metaphorically, it's also like a spiritual reference, stagnating in terms of our spirituality, just getting into the same rhythm and a ritualistic kind of approach in which we forget the meanings, or we stop trying new things that would keep that process in our lives like very much exciting for us, even our ibadah, right? Doing things differently, etc. So he's very much against the concept of stagnation. He is promoting movement. And in this particular case, outwardly, the meaning of the poem is physical movement, traveling, right? And this reflects, Imam Shafi'i, of course, needs no introduction. He's one of the greatest scholars of our ummah, and this reflects sort of a, very important, something that was held very important by many of the scholars, by many of our teachers, right, from the past, that traveling is essential to the development of a Muslim. And in fact, there's a very interesting proverb, a saying that the Uyghur Muslims have, the Uyghur Muslims of Central Asia, in which they say that the person who has not traveled cannot truly be a Muslim. That, there are so many sort of lessons and so many self-development processes that are embedded specifically in traveling, that unless you've traveled to some extent, you have not tapped into those parts of your spirituality. You can't truly be a Muslim. Now, the most important, I guess, impetus, because of course not everyone likes to travel, right? There are people, and that's fine as well. There are people who may not like to travel. But the most important sort of encouragement and directing your focus in this regard is, of course, the pilgrimage, right? The Umrah or the Hajj, and the Hajj, which is one of the 5 pillars of Islam, is something that for those who are able, meeting certain conditions, should strive to do. And even today, but even more so throughout history, going for Hajj was going to be a somewhat challenging, somewhat arduous, difficult kind of process, and it was going to be a long process. Like, subhanallah, there's this whole conversation about, Mecca being at the center of terra firma, at the center of the land mass of the earth, right? And the centrality of it, and people coming from then all directions of the world where humans have inhabited to perform this sort of act of worship that has been obligated for us, right? And so Mecca has always been very central, not just to Muslims' travel, right? So many of their journeys, as we'll see in the journey of Ibn Battuta, right? It begins as a journey to Mecca, right? That's what the film that you will see after this presentation is called. But many other travelers, maybe they were traveling for different reasons. They were coming from many different places. They had even perhaps many different understandings of Islam or sort of cultural practices, and very, very different backgrounds and walks of life. But the one thing that they have in common is this physical action that they have to perform, and the spiritual actions that are associated with it, of going to Mecca to perform Umrah and Hajj. And that is taking them as travelers to different parts of the Muslim world. And intellectually as well, so much of what we learn about what Muslims did for science, right, and what Muslims did in different fields of art and culture, etc., was inspired by particular needs that the community had that were related to Mecca, such as finding the direction of the Qibla, right? And so just to explain what these two diagrams are specifically, both of these are pages from manuscripts from the Ottoman period. The first one on your left side is actually a history of the West Indies that was written in the Ottoman Empire. So, newsflash, the Ottomans did have somewhat of an interest in the West Indies, right? So this is in the 1600s, but they made sure to emphasize no matter which lands are being discovered and settled and colonized, or whichever processes are going on the earth, at the very center of their conception of the earth is the Kaaba, the city of Mecca. And the other manuscript is basically a chart that is used to, no matter where your location is on the earth, identify the direction that you have to pray in, as that is our Qibla, right? So the centrality of Mecca, of the Kaaba, have played many different roles. And of course, they've also played many different roles in terms of bringing the ummah together, being this unifying experience for the ummah, right? So what do all of the people who are in this picture, how many things do they have in common? Of course, their faith is in common. They are all Muslims, right? But they're all from very different parts of the world. They all practice very different cultures. They all lived in different time periods, right? This is 1,400 years of history. But this common connection is bringing them, and especially for people who were newly perhaps converted to Islam, or had somehow become distant from the religion, and we're coming back to being closer to embracing it, and all these different kinds of situations. This experience has really enriched that for them. So the most prominent example that we know of is, of course, like Malcolm X, right? But you also have the first known Japanese convert to Islam, Umar Yamaoka, right? About 100 years ago, he performs the Hajj. By the way, these lines are just kind of, you can tell they're not the routes that they took, right? These are just kind of to illustrate. But as Umar Yamaoka is moving from Japan to ultimately to the Kaaba, and by the way, when Umar Yamaoka left, he wasn't even Muslim. When he left Japan, he wasn't even Muslim. He was interested in Islam as a scholar. And by the time, he travels through like Indo-Malaya, he travels through India, and he gets to the Hijaz, by the time he actually gets there, he has embraced Islam, and he gets the opportunity to actually go inside the Kaaba and pray inside the Kaaba and perform Hajj, right? You have a Mongol princess. Her grandfather, Hulagu Khan, was the person who destroyed Baghdad, and basically that turning point in the history of Muslim civilization. His granddaughter embraces Islam, even though hardly anyone in her family has done so. Her name is Al-Qutlu Khatun, right? And she performs the Hajj. And, along the journey of performing Hajj, she's embracing her traditional Mongol culture, in a way that doesn't interfere with the rulings related to Hajj, right? You have Zainab Cobbold, one of the earliest British converts to Islam, right? You have Mansa Musa, you can see there, one of the most famous journeys for the Hajj. I'm sure many of you have heard of it. He's considered to be probably the wealthiest person who ever lived, but taking this massive caravan across Africa from the kingdom of Mali to perform the Hajj, giving a lot of sadaqah along the way, meeting a lot of scholars along the way, having conversations about bringing some of those scholars back into West Africa to contribute to this rich Islamic scholarly tradition in West Africa. So it is very much a unifying force. And these are just, 5 examples. There are countless more examples, right, that we know of. And then beyond that, there are even more that we don't know of every single person's own journey to this one central place in Islam. And even beyond those journeys, let's talk about other journeys now, right? There's a very important aspect of carrying the faith with you as you travel, right? Not just the Islamic knowledge that you have in a physical form. So, for example, books or things like that, but also in an embodied form, like the Quran that we memorize, right? The prayers and all of these acts of worship that we have memorized, right? If someone were to drop you off in a random island, if you have some basic education about certain aspects of the Islamic tradition, you should be able to figure out when Ramadan is going to start, when you have to fast, and all of these kinds of things, right? This is basic knowledge that we all sort of learn. And carrying that faith with you in different forms. So I'm going to give you a few examples here, right? The first one is a famous Jewish philosopher named Maimonides, but he lived in Al-Andalus in Muslim Spain. And there was a difficult situation in Al-Andalus which forced him to try to move to Egypt. On this journey from Spain to Egypt through the Mediterranean Sea, he is traveling on a ship during Ramadan. And one of the things that's recorded is that the people who were traveling on the ship, the Muslims, were praying Taraweeh on the ship, right? So even though they probably could have found like a valid excuse to not pray Taraweeh, they're traveling, right? They are continuing to travel on the Mediterranean Sea. I want us all to kind of imagine this scene. And a rumor spread that Maimonides, this Jewish person who was traveling with them, had also been seen like joining the prayer, right? And then the rumor, obviously, the next step after that was to say, okay, maybe he's secretly Muslim or he's embraced Islam. So there was a bit of a stir, right? And this is about like 800 years ago. There's a bit of a stir that Maimonides has embraced Islam. So, but the key interesting thing for me in that whole conversation is the fact that Taraweeh is being prayed even on this ship, on this journey in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. Another different kind of example are the journeys of a well-known hadith scholar and educator named Fatima bin Saad al-Khair. In fact, her journeys as well as her father's journeys. So the journey you see here in the thick sort of maroon line is actually half the journey of her family, because her story also begins in Spain. So her father is a scholar in Spain. As the Muslims gradually lose control of Spain, the situation becomes difficult. So the father moves from Spain all the way into the eastern lands, like the Far East, into China. And she is born in the Uyghur lands in Central Asia. You can see the city of Kashgar there is sort of where her journey starts. Now, she is educated there along with her 5 sisters. Her father educates all of them, and they had one younger brother. His father educates all of this family in sort of the Islamic tradition, in the hadith sciences, etc. And then her journey begins again. And as an adult, she continues. She moves through Central Asia. She moves through what is present-day Persia, Iran, right? She moves through like Iraq, right? Through Syria, through Palestine, and ultimately settles in Egypt. And then she becomes so famous as a hadith scholar that people come from different regions. So you see the other thick arrows, people are coming from different regions to now study hadith with her, and then taking that knowledge back to different parts of that region. So this is how like the movement of knowledge Lewis was an Orientalist, very problematic in many ways, but this book that he wrote is nevertheless an excellent resource, right? So he writes this book, The Muslim Discovery of Europe, and it really traces the very first Muslims who ever went to Europe and spent significant time there. And some of them were travelers, some of them were diplomats, a lot of them were actually prisoners, right? So the oldest presence of Muslims we have in a city like Istanbul, which is a Muslim majority city today, is actually Muslim prisoners who were imprisoned in Istanbul, or a famous person named Harun who was imprisoned in Rome in Italy, right? And this is, we're talking more than 1,000 years ago. But they're carrying their faith with them, and they're maintaining their faith and actually spreading their faith, especially in the case of the transatlantic slave trade. So the other book I really highly encourage everyone to read is Servants of Allah by Sylviane Diouf. And she, again, like she goes into all of these details of not only in those very, very disruptive and difficult circumstances of enslavement, where these Muslim enslaved people from West Africa maintaining their faith in places like the United States and places like Brazil, right? But they were also spreading their faith, which is why Muslims were repeatedly banned from being brought even as slaves by the Spanish, right? Early on, very early on in the 1500s, the Spanish would repeatedly ban the import of Muslim slaves, because not only would they maintain their own traditions, no matter what the sort of the settler colonialist project tried to force on them, but they would also spread their faith, perhaps to indigenous people, perhaps to West Africans who were not Muslim, etc. Right? So highly recommend both of these books to you. Now, the most famous traveler, perhaps Muslim traveler, is Ibn Battuta, a name I'm sure many of you have heard, right? And this map, by the way, not only shows his journeys, but also the journeys of another Muslim traveler whose name is Cheng He. So we'll talk about him in a second. And then the more famous, you might have heard of Marco Polo, right? But you can see that Ibn Battuta had a lot more activity going on than the rest of them. I'm not going to go into the details of his story because, as you can see from the map, there is a lot to talk about there, and because there's going to be a film screening. So I strongly recommend everyone kind of, stay for that and watch that. It's an incredible film about the start of his journeys. But the point I wanted to bring up about Ibn Battuta's journeys, right, apart from all the interesting things we could talk about, is actually how neglected the spiritual element, of his story is as a Muslim traveler. And Muslim not just in the sense that he was of Muslim background or something, but someone who very, very closely adhered to the teachings of Islam, the limitations of Islam that he felt needed to be preserved, right? Because this is often what happens when we're traveling. We go to a certain place and we see a certain culture, and it's great to appreciate different cultures. That's also very important. But sometimes we begin to assimilate a little too easily or accept things a little too easily, despite the fact that they may not be acceptable within the framework of Islamic teachings. So to give you a few examples, right? In fact, my famous example is if you pay attention here, like to that northern part, if you follow me to like where, if you know where Turkey is today, I'm sure most of you do, right? And you see his journey to Constantinople. And all of that leg had only one purpose in the far north. That entire journey had one purpose, which was an opportunity for him to go to Constantinople. So he does that, and the building he sees when he gets to Constantinople is the same building that we see today. Obviously, it's been changed over time. They added minarets and some domes and things like that. But the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, right, is the same building he sees. And he's the kind of person who would never let go of an opportunity to fully, check out all the walls and the doors and everything like that. But when he gets to the door, literally, this is what he tells of his story. He gets to the door of the Hagia Sophia, and he's told that when you go inside, you have to prostrate. This is a custom that everyone has to follow. If you go inside, because it's a church at the time, right? If you go inside, you have to follow the custom. He refuses to go inside, and he says, I will see what I can see, basically from the door. But I will not go inside. Although in other circumstances, like he stayed with his family in a church during his travels, right? He slept in a church. He had great relations with like Christian communities that he met all over the place. But in this specific case, it's a matter of, I am only going to prostrate before Allah. Nothing else. Doesn't matter how much I work to get here and how badly I want to see this thing and go inside, I will not do it, right? Constantly in his story, he emphasizes the traveler's reliance on Allah, right? And how traveling actually builds your reliance on Allah, because you're always a little bit uncomfortable. You're in new places, you're meeting new people. It's not your hometown, it's not your own neighborhood, right? Again, he has an appreciation for culture. He really does, Ibn Battuta, if you read his story, but he does not indulge in moral relativism. He does not kind of go with, well, everyone does their own thing and all of this is okay, right? And this goes, by the way, for the Muslims he meets and the non-Muslims. When he sees something that he feels is not in line with the teachings of Islam, he clarifies that. And when he sees people doing things that he does feel are in line with the teachings of Islam, he recognizes that, he acknowledges that, and expresses his appreciation for it. He performed Hajj several times in his journeys, like several times, right? Again, he does not have to, right? His obligation is fulfilled after the first time he performs Hajj, right? He perhaps could have gone to other places, right? Use that time and instead of detouring back to the Hajj, but he constantly reminds us of like his own particular, like what is really matters. All of this travel is great, he's enjoying it, etc. But what really matters is what he's coming back to. Everywhere he goes, he strives to meet the local scholars, the local mystics, and to learn something from them, get their advice, share his own story with them. And then his concluding words of his rihla, of the book that he ultimately wrote, right? I won't read them to you because they are on the posters over there. So if you haven't checked out the poster exhibition, please do afterwards. It's a very, very beautiful quote that he ends with about how, like, he says basically, I traveled more than anyone I have ever heard of ever traveling, right? But the real journey still remains. The real journey is the journey of this life. I will pass away. I will go to the barzakh, right, on the day of judgment. And then, may Allah send me to a good place is basically what he's saying. But he says it more beautifully, so I still encourage you to read it. Now, what about geographical knowledge, right? Just very quickly. Some key names to keep in mind are right there. Al-Mas'udi, Al-Khwarizmi, Al-Biruni. You may have heard some of these names already. And just to keep, they have many accomplishments. All of them are polymaths, but specifically in the area of geography, Al-Khwarizmi, he corrected estimates of the size of the Mediterranean Sea, and he argued that the Atlantic and Indian Oceans were open bodies of water, because before it was assumed that there was land like all around them, right? They were like a lake. But he says, no, they are open bodies of water. And both of these contributions, right, really help with travel, because now you can make plans. If the Mediterranean Sea is suddenly a lot smaller, maybe you can be a bit more daring and try to go further and explore new places. Same thing with the Atlantic and the Indian Oceans. He also produces a list of coordinates, longitude and latitude, for over 1,000 places in the world, basically making it easier for travelers to find them using basic navigation. Mas'udi was a traveler himself. He traveled to a lot of places, and he tried to meet as many people as he could who had traveled to different places and compile the information that they had about the cultures of those places and the geography and things like that. And some of his work is still available to us. It's been translated into English, and so you can find it. What's also interesting is that he drew a map of the world, which you can see there, and there's an unknown continent that he identifies, that big kind of continent at the top off the coast of Africa. And there's speculation about what he kind of meant by calling that an unknown continent. Some people say that there was some awareness of the existence of the Americas, right, as we call them today. Maybe it's Antarctica or something else. Maybe he just misjudged wildly the size of some island. But keep in mind the date. This is he died in 956. So this is very, very early on. Al-Biruni, one of my favorite people from history, very accurately estimates the circumference of the earth. So he is in what is today present-day Pakistan. He is there with Mahmud of Ghazni during one of his expeditions. He is standing on top of one of these mountains in Punjab, and he says, if I could just have an astrolabe and some basic knowledge of trigonometry, I could use this situation. I'm looking down at a valley. I could use this situation to calculate the circumference of the earth. And he very, very accurately calculates, just using an astrolabe and his knowledge of trigonometry. Like you can see the way he calculated that over there, very accurately calculates the circumference of the earth. And then he hypothesizes that a large continent, a significant landmass, has to exist in Al-Bahr al-Muhit, which is what the Muslims sort of referred to as the Atlantic Ocean, right? It was the encompassing ocean, because they thought that obviously it goes all the way around the world to the other side, to China, right? And he's saying, no, a landmass of significant size has to exist somewhere in that space for this to geologically make sense, and also based on, again, the livable zones of the Earth's climate. He said it's possible for people to live there. And so this is the first kind of hypothetical references that we find to the Americas and also to the indigenous peoples, right, who we know for a fact were living here at the time. The Muslims developed several tools for travel. The kind of situation you see at the top left there, that's called the Kamal, right? And you can read more about that, again, as part of the exhibit over there. But basically, it's a tool you use to look at the North Star, and then you are able to find your location at the sea especially, right? But other instruments that the Muslims borrowed basically from the previous civilizations and then improved upon are the compass. As you can see, this is the astrolabe and the quadrant. Now, I'm not going to go into the technical details, partly because I myself don't fully understand the technical details, right? All I know is that these are very, very important tools for navigation that were used, borrowed from the Muslims, not just by the West, but also by China, right? So some of the later Chinese expeditions and navigation that happened, there was this, cultural exchange of information that was going both ways. A key map maker who was Muslim historically is Al-Idrisi. He was originally from Morocco, but he worked on the island of Sicily, which is now part of Italy. Sicily was also ruled by Muslims for several hundred years, but by the time he was alive, they had lost political control of the island, but the culture of the Muslims very much influenced the culture of Sicily. And he was involved in developing the tabula Rogerina for King Roger II of Sicily. And this is one of the most detailed maps of the Middle Ages of the known world at the time, right? And you often see, you might recognize the flat version of the map, but the one he actually constructed was this one. So there's a lot of, it's not just kind of arbitrarily drawing things on a map, but there's a lot of calculation, a lot of thought being put into very, very precisely figuring out these things. There's no International Space Station going around giving you pictures or any satellites or anything like that. So it's remarkable how in certain areas of the world, especially, they're able to get so accurate with that. The map of Piri Reis, which you may also have heard of, in 1513 is sort of when the map was developed. And the most remarkable thing, out of several remarkable things about this map is, again, it's the year 1513. It's very early on. Remember, Columbus sailed in 1492, right? So this is very early on after that. And of course, there's some exploration happening by the Spanish in particular, but the amount of detail that is shown of the South American coastline, the eastern South American coastline, like the coast of Brazil, and the accuracy of it. The other thing is that the placement of Africa and South America, in most other maps, this is very, very accurate. In most other maps, it would not be coming close to the accuracy of this map until much later, right? So there's all of these interesting details in this particular map, and this was a world map. This was just the fragment that was found, right? Alhamdulillah, we found probably the most interesting fragment, right? Which was preserved. But this is the fragment that was found. And so there's a lot of ongoing conversation, speculation about, okay, where else could this knowledge have come from? And again, that whole conversation about, did people come to the Americas before Columbus. And this is a key piece of evidence that opens up certain questions, right? If it doesn't answer them, but it still keeps them open. The other skills involved with exploration and navigation include obviously organizing large expeditions, and we have two famous examples. First one is Mansa Abu Bakr, and the second one is Cheng He. So this is obviously showing Mansa Abu Bakr, the king of the Mali Empire in West Africa, and he organized two expeditions, right? And again, a lot of thought has to be put into this. When you're going out into the sea, like you can't just kind of jump on any kind of raft or boat or something like that and just go. He had a particular interest in seeing what else there was to be found in the Atlantic Ocean, right? And he was so convinced about it, which itself raises some questions about, did he have some information that really told him that there is something to find, more land to find on the other end. So he organizes these two expeditions in 1310 and 1312, and you can see there the kind of all of the work that goes into putting these together, right? You have to have megaliths built. These are huge stone observatories that help you make basically astronomical measurements that can then help you when you sail out to sea. He has 200 ships built the first time, stocked with things like gold and trade goods, dried meat, right, grain, fruit preserved in these huge ceramic jars. The first expedition, he eagerly waits for news from them, and they come back saying that there was a river in the sea that basically took the expedition, and there's basically only one ship that survived, and one of the survivors makes it back to Africa to tell Mansa Abu Bakr this news. And some scholars have speculated that particular description, like a river in the sea, that might refer to like the Comoros Islands. Others have said it might refer to the Amazon River and things like that. So again, it's open to speculation. Then he organizes the second expedition, which is much larger, and he decides to lead it himself. And it does seem to be organized very much as like if we're permanently, like we're gone, right? We are either going to find something or we are not going to come back. And this is when he hands over the reins of the empire to a relative of his, which is Mansa Musa, right? So he was preceding Mansa Abu Bakr. The other person is Cheng He, who is also Muslim. And he is the employee and admiral for the Ming Dynasty. And you can see he has 7 voyages, right? So they've marked in this infographic all the voyages in different colors. And there's a lot of interesting kind of details here. But some of the key details I want to mention are that Cheng He, using this personal opportunity that he had to advance the interests of Muslims, so building a lot of mosques, right? He wasn't on a da'wah mission necessarily. He was working for the Ming Dynasty, but he did take the opportunity and his position of influence as a traveler to support the Muslims in different ways in different regions. So a lot of the mosques, and if you go to Southeast Asia today, a lot of the mosques still are named after him. They pay a lot of tribute to him and that sort of thing. Similarly, he is not able to go on his 7th voyage to Mecca himself to perform the Hajj, but he sent some of his sailors, and it's possible that he was, planning to perform the Hajj himself on another voyage, that he was planning more, but of course he passed away before he was able to do that. Supporting other communities in East Africa, on the East African coast. And in fact, to this day, there are these mixed, Chinese and East African Swahili communities, which are believed to be descendants of some of the sailors that were left behind from the voyages of Cheng He, right? So very important person to read about, to learn about. There's a lot to read about him, so I would encourage you to do that. Now, coming more to the present and coming more to discussing like Muslim travelers in the Americas, I'm going to try to go through this quickly, but just keep the names especially in mind and some of the resources that you see up there, because then of course you can look them up and do the reading and learn a lot more. The Moor's account is actually a novel. The one at the top is a nonfiction book. But this person is Mustafa Azamuri. He's known as Esteban the Moor, right? And he was captured and enslaved from Morocco and brought to New Spain which was, of course, much of the Caribbean and Mexico today, as part of an expedition that was going to colonize what is today Florida, the state of Florida, right? So Florida had not been colonized yet. He was brought enslaved to take part in that expedition. So first they go to Cuba, right, to Havana, and then from there they go to Florida, and are absolutely, the entire expedition is destroyed by the environment and the indigenous people in Florida, who are obviously fighting back against these people who are coming in. And only 4 of the hundreds of people who were part of the expedition survived, and Mustafa is one of them. So they build these rafts based on whatever is available, and they just push themselves out into the Caribbean, sailing along the coast of the southern United States until they basically land in what is Galveston, Texas, right? And again, keep the dates in mind, like this is almost 500 years ago that this person, Mustafa Azamuri, is hanging out in Texas, right? And then they travel for 8 years, basically walking across the southwestern United States, what would become the southwestern United States, and then down into Mexico City. And Mustafa, out of that group, especially emerges as sort of a leader, even though initially he was enslaved, but he becomes an interpreter and a healer within those indigenous communities. They recognize him as such, and many of them consider him a friend. Again, a lot more details to the story, but you can read about it. Another very interesting story is about this person, Amir Chigala, who went by the name of Giorgio Zapata, right, captain. So again, keep the year in mind. He arrives in Bolivia in South America in 1561, very, very early on, and he's pretending to be Spanish. He becomes very rich as a miner, mining silver especially. After 15 years in Bolivia, he decides to return home, and obviously everyone thinks, okay, he's going back to Spain. Where he actually ends up is in Istanbul, and it turns out he has been Turkish this entire time. He goes to Sultan Murad II, tells him his story, gives him like some of the, when he went back, he took all kinds of like 138 kilograms of pure gold and like even more silver. He gives him some of that. He becomes an admiral in the Ottoman Navy. He has a great Navy career. And then he's appointed the governor of Algiers in Algeria, right? And one of the people he used to work with as a miner in South America becomes enslaved and ends up in Algiers, and ends up being enslaved to one of the relatives of Amir Chigala. So there's this incredible reunion of these two people who used to work together in Bolivia. And then of course his story, we don't know much after that, but it's incredible enough as it is. Another person I want to talk about is Ali Abu Chadi, so a Muslim traveler in a sense within Canada, one of the earliest Muslims who settled in Canada. So he leaves Lebanon in 1905, and he lived a very long life, died in Edmonton in 1985. So this is his route, if you can just kind of picture, right? And I'll show you a map in a second, but he's starting off in the village of Lala in Lebanon. He goes to Beirut, right? He's about 13-year-old when he leaves his village and goes to Beirut, and he's going to take a ship from there to Marseille, go to Montreal, go to Winnipeg, go to the most unheard of places in places like the Northwest Territories and Saskatchewan, obviously in Edmonton, and then sails all the way up to the Arctic Circle to Aklavik, Northwest Territories, trading with indigenous people. So he had become involved in the fur trade. He would buy furs from the indigenous communities and sell them the goods that they needed, because his store was actually a boat. So he was sailing up and down the Mackenzie River, right, for years. Makes several trips to Lebanon. He performs the Hajj twice. After retiring, he travels to many other places as well, UK, India, parts of South America. And he said, in his own words, every state of the United States except Alaska. That's where he didn't go. He was involved in peddling, homesteading, fur trading, like I mentioned. He learned the Cree language to be able to speak to the indigenous people. And he married a Ukrainian-Canadian wife who performed Hajj with him. So you can see, like, if you visualize these journeys, right, you can see in the blue there, you have, these are some of the key points where they stopped. Obviously not a map of the exact journey, but you can see Amir Chigala, right, in the blue. You can see Mustafa Azamuri in the yellow. You can see in the red, you have Ali Abu Chadi, right? And look how far up Aklavik is in the Northwest Territories. So for a person who started off as a 13-year-old leaving his village, he traveled very, very far and then after retiring in Canada, he continues to travel. And finally, I want to talk about this person who is one of the most well-traveled people of Muslim background, but hardly anyone has ever heard his story, and that is Muhammad Ali bin Said, or as he became known, Nicholas Said. So he was born in Borno in Central West Africa around 1836. He's captured and enslaved by Muslims, right? So this is another important conversation that has to happen, the history of slavery in Muslim cultures and what that has looked like. But he's enslaved. He travels through, I'll show you a map, all of these places, right? He learns 9 languages along the way. And by the way, he's not enslaved the entire time. So by the time he gets to Russia, once he gets to Istanbul, by the time he goes from there into Russia, after that, it's essentially his own choice to continue traveling to where he wants. And he does plan to eventually return home to his family, but this urge that has developed within him to continue to travel keeps him going. Ultimately, he ends up fighting for the Union Army in the American Civil War. And after the Civil War, he got married in Alabama and died in Brownsville, Tennessee, where he's buried. But before he died, thankfully, he leaves us a 224-page autobiography with all of these incredible, details of his journeys, right? And this is why I couldn't put him on the map with the others, because that would just be unfair to everyone else, right? Starts off again in Central West Africa, and this is not a complete list, right? He actually spent some time in South America as well. So as far as we know, again, in the mid 1800s, he is the first Muslim, probably as far as we know, to visit 5 continents, right? Starts off in Africa, goes to Asia, goes to Europe, goes to South America, and then finally ends up in North America, including, by the way, he went to Niagara Falls, Hamilton, Toronto, Kingston, and this is in the 1860s, right? He went to Montreal, he went to Ottawa, and then he made all his way back all the way to Detroit, back into the United States. So that essentially is where I'm going to wrap up my presentation. Thank you all for listening. Again, it's very, very incomplete. It's food for thought. Hopefully it encourages you to learn more about this topic, right? Be careful, but at the same time, be curious, and you can learn a lot just by Googling. And you have certain names now, some things to keep in mind. So start your search, put some time into it. And may Allah enrich our traveling experiences, give us tawfiq to travel in ways that are pleasing to Him and that help us attain fulfillment in this life and attain His pleasure in this life and the next. Jazakallah khair to the organizers for inviting me and giving me this opportunity. And I apologize for going way over time. So I will leave it at that. Jazakumullah khair and assalamu alaikum.
Jazakumullah khair. Thank you very much, Brother Hassam. It's been quite an interesting presentation, and I would encourage you to look at it again on YouTube when you get home, and to share it with some of your family and friends. And Brother Hassam would also agree that this is just a tip of the iceberg. We haven't even talked about Barbarossa and all of the journeys that he made. Conquering many places for the Muslim world. What we can say very clearly is that perhaps today there is no place on the face of the earth in which Islam has not reached, and this is thanks to many of the great people who have actually taken travel as part of their life journey, and they have taken Islam with them all over the place. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward them. Brother Hassam, I believe you will be with us until the end of the program. In case there are anyone who would like to interact with him afterwards and ask him some questions, and he might be able to provide you some other reference material. Before we go to the other part of the program, I want to reiterate that Dr. Abdullah Hakim Quick is here with us. He has been the person who has grounded us in this Islamic History Month. And, just today I got a note about his presentation at the University of Toronto. The students there gave him a very glowing reference. So I would like to publicly thank Dr. Abdullah Hakim Quick and all of our brothers and sisters who put this program together. Brother Mamoon Hassan, who is not just our videographer, but also part of ensuring that the programming aspect of this is very clear. Brother Abdurrahman, Jean, who ensures that, the logistics of all of this and the setting up of the exhibits. And we have a number of other people, Brother Ilyas and our counselors from the summer camp and other volunteers. Alhamdulillah, they have worked very hard on this. I also want to remind you that Dr. Abdullah has a number of books available for sale. So before you leave, inshallah, I would encourage you to purchase a book. Much of what has been said here today can be found in the Deeper Roots book. And there's also the book on holiday myths. So we have Halloween coming up and Christmas and New Year's. The book on holiday myths makes it very clear as to the origin of these practices and gives us a clear direction as a Muslim how we should approach them. So without further ado, I know that we have to set up for the movie, and many of you youngsters have come for that. Jazakumullah khair. This movie was shown at the Ontario Science Centre many years ago. Some of you may have seen it. We don't have an IMAX screen. We have a mini max. And so inshallah, we will be showing it on the screen. Jazakumullah khair. Thank you for your patience again. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.